Good afternoon. My name is Max Latona, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance at St. Anselm College. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar and virtual discussion on Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, a Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about our organization, our partners, and the format for today's program. The Center for Ethics at St. Anselm College has for its mission to assist communities and organizations in addressing the pressing ethical issues that they face, and to do so through research, education, dialogue, and collaboration. In this sense, today's program represents the essence of who we are, where we are gathered here as a community to listen, learn, and reflect on the enduring historical and ethical problem of segregation in the housing industry, in our cities, in our towns, and in our communities. Why did this happen? Did our government play a role? What are the enduring effects of this segregation? And how can we address it? Our center firmly believes that in order for our society to address fundamental challenges like this, we need to bring to bear all of our resources: learned minds, courageous voices, empathetic ears, and a desire to roll up our sleeves and work together towards a solution. It is in such collaboration and support that some of the center's most valuable community partners have joined together to make this program possible. These partners are Northeast Delta Dental, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Chinburg Properties, New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, and Cambridge Trust. We thank them for their support. Our format for today is as follows. In the first 40 minutes, we'll hear from our main speaker for today. After he concludes, I will introduce our panel moderator, who will in turn introduce the panelists and lead the discussion for the remaining 35 to 40 minutes. We will close by 5:30 at the latest. As required by state law, I remind all present that this event is recorded. Questions and feedback can be sent to ethics@stanselm.edu. Without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods and patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. He is also the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found on his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. Previous influential books include Class in Schools: Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education: Getting Accountability Right. He welcomes questions and comments at riroth@epi.org. Mr. Rothstein, we are glad to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Max. Thanks all of you in New Hampshire for engaging with me in this conversation today. Let me begin by reminding everyone that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, then went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. Then, as you all know, in 1954, it challenged segregation successfully, legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Supreme Court decision of 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a civil rights movement of activists. They engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. But by the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement had persuaded a large number of Americans, maybe not everyone, maybe not even a majority, but a large number of Americans, that racial segregation was wrong It was immoral. It was harmful to both blacks and whites. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And with that understanding, and by making what John Lewis called good trouble, they succeeded in ending segregation in public accommodations and interstate transportation, in employment, passed a fair housing law that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But by the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended, went home, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them, and some of you have lived, I'm sure, in more than one. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white, mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black, mostly black. How could that be? How could it be that we persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, and yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly I think it's because it's more difficult to end segregation of neighborhoods than to end segregation of water fountains or lunch counters. Pass an ordinance saying you can no longer have separate water fountains, no longer prohibit African Americans from sitting at a lunch counter, and the next day you can drink from any water fountain or go to any restaurant that you want. But if we pass a law saying we can't have segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners, blacks and whites, all of us have adopted a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves to avoid ending the segregation of neighborhoods, as we must if we understand that segregation is wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, a stain on our democratic society. The rationalization, the excuse, goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of lunch counters or restaurants or water fountains or swimming pools or any of the other things we addressed in the 20th century, certainly schools and colleges, that was unconstitutional because it was created by government, by law, by public policy, by ordinance, by regulation. And we understand that if the federal government is requiring segregation, for example, on interstate transportation, that violates the Fifth Amendment. If state and local governments are requiring segregation in restaurants, it violates the 14th Amendment. These are civil rights violations. And as American citizens, if we take our constitutional responsibilities seriously, we have an obligation to end it, to remedy that segregation. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally. It happened because maybe bigoted white homeowners and landlords wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe actors in the private economy, businesses like real estate agencies and banks, discriminated in how they carried out their functions. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable being around people whose skin is the same color as ours. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all an economic thing. African Americans on average have lower incomes than whites and so can't afford, in many cases, to move to white middle-class neighborhoods. And that's why we have segregation. All of these individual, personal, bigoted, but private activities, not government action, is what created segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this explanation. We say what we've got is de facto segregation, a term we all use. It just sort of happened in fact, not in law. Well, as you heard from Max's introduction, I spent a lot of time writing about and explaining education policy. That was my field. I was not an expert in housing policy until 10 years ago or so. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent most of my time, I'd say, trying to explain why the dominant education policy that we're following in this country made no sense. What we said was that the biggest problem that schools faced was an achievement gap between Black and white children. African American children, on average, achieved at lower levels than white children. And we said that the reason that there was an achievement gap between Black and white children is because teachers were bigoted. They didn't try very hard to teach Black children. And if only we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. It was a ludicrous theory, and yet we enacted it into federal law. It was called the No Child Left Behind Law of 2001. We started testing children every year, shaming teachers if their students didn't achieve, if their Black children didn't achieve at the same level of middle-class children, punishing them, punishing the schools, and it did no good. It had no measurable effect whatsoever on the achievement gap. But that was a law that we passed. And I tried to explain why it was so ludicrous to have such a policy. It's not that some teachers didn't have low expectations. Of course they did. But that didn't explain the achievement gap. The biggest cause of the achievement gap was the social and economic conditions. The children in low-income minority neighborhoods came to school with that impedes their achievement. So I remember writing one column, for example, about asthma. As you may know, African-American children in low-income neighborhoods in this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. They have asthma because they grow up in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more empty lots with dirt, more vermin in the environment. And I tried to explain that if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child without asthma. More likely, not necessarily, but more likely to be up at night wheezing, coming to school sleepy the next day, drowsy. And if you had 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown of the group, same social and economic characteristics, same family structure, except one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other. That was the only difference between the 2 groups. That group would have lower average achievement, simply because more of that group was going to be drowsy in school than the group without asthma. That made a difference, a tiny difference in the achievement gap. But then when you think about other conditions, lead poisoning that has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity, overcrowding, you begin to add all these up, you can do the same kind of comparison. Each of them has a measurable impact on the achievement gap. And by the time you've added them all up, you've got the explanation. Well, I began to think that it's one thing if a child comes to school with asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens if every child in the school has one or more of these challenges? How can a school like that ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come to school well-rested, well-nourished, in secure economic environments, not overcrowded? No matter how many laws you pass, no matter how often you test a child, how can you ever eliminate the achievement gap so long as those conditions remain untouched? Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been at any time in the last 50 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began about 10 years ago, a little bit more, to think of neighborhood segregation as an educational issue. That's how I came to this topic. That's how I came to the research that led to this book. Well, in 2007, as I was thinking about these things, I read a Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court was considering a policy that was enacted by 2 school districts. One was Louisville, Kentucky. The other was Seattle, Washington. Both of them gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would minimize segregation. It's a very, very token plan. If you had a school that was all white and mostly white, you had one place left, and both a Black and a white child applied for that last place. the black child be given some preference because that child would help to minimize the segregation of the school. You don't have one place left very often and have to choose between a black and a white parent. So it wasn't a very significant program, but the Supreme Court examined it, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion. He explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. I actually thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That is why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. And he went on to say the schools in those cities are segregated de facto, just in fact, not in law, not because of government activity, not because of government requirement, just because of private bigotry and the actions of businesses in the private economy and people liking to live with each other of the same race and income differences. And he said, we have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government. Government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts that was the subject of this decision. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was an all-white suburb outside Louisville called Shively, single-family homes, all white. One of the homeowners in that all-white suburb had an African-American friend living in downtown Louisville, renting an apartment. He was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. Good job. Wanted to move to a single-family home to raise his family. Nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this single-family home, living in Shively, bought a second home in that community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry white mob, protected by the police, surrounded the home, threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. Dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts are all mobilized to enforce the racial boundaries of St. Louis, maybe there's something about the history of Louisville, Kentucky that Chief Justice John Roberts either doesn't know or doesn't want to know. Well, I looked into it further and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases like this. I'm not exaggerating. Mob violence, frequently protected by the police, sometimes organized and led by the police to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously all-white neighborhoods in the 20th century. Every one of these where the police were involved in protecting, organizing, leading. This mob violence was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, not de facto segregation, something that all of us as American citizens have an obligation to remedy, an obligation we've never assumed. And then I began to look into it further, and I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that maintained the racial boundaries of this country, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that were explicitly designed on a racially explicit basis to enforce, sustain, perpetuate racial segregation. Every one of these policies was a constitutional violation. De facto segregation, I concluded, is an utter myth, has no basis in reality to it whatsoever. We have an unconstitutional system of racial segregation in this country, and all of us as American citizens have an obligation to remedy it. Well, let me spend a few minutes this afternoon describing some of the chief policies that the federal government followed to enforce, create, perpetuate, and sustain racial segregation in America. I don't have time to go into many of them. There were many state, local policies as well, other policies of the federal government, but I'll describe a couple of the most powerful federal ones. Perhaps the most powerful was a policy in the post-World War II period of the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations to create entirely white suburbs surrounding every city in this country and to move white working class families out of urban areas into those single family home, all white suburbs like Shively in St. Louis. You're familiar with these suburbs. They exist in every metropolitan area in this country today. We've created a white noose around urban America. The suburbs didn't exist before the post-World War II period. We were not a suburban country prior to that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent families who owned automobiles. Most working class and lower middle class families were living in urban areas, black and white. They needed to be living near deep water ports or railroad terminals because that's where all the jobs were. We were a manufacturing economy, none of this internet stuff going on in those days. And so you had broadly integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas in every metropolitan community. The federal government embarked on an explicit racial program to move white working class and lower middle class families out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs and to prohibit African Americans from doing the same. The most famous of these suburbs is probably Levittown, east of New York City. I'm sure you've heard of that, but there were thousands of these everywhere. 17,000 homes in Levittown in one place, east of New York City, in an enormous subdivision, but equally large ones were built elsewhere, south of San Francisco, one with 15,000 homes, south of Los Angeles, also 15,000, and many smaller ones as well, everywhere in the country. A builder like Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do that. We weren't a suburban country at the time. Nobody thought that anybody would want to move to suburbs like this. He had no buyers for the project. No bank was willing to lend him the money to do it. The only way that Levitt and any of these other developers anywhere in the country could build these all-white suburbs in the mid-20th century was by going to the Federal Housing Administration or Veterans Administration in the period after World War II, submitting their plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the layout of the streets, the materials they were going to use, and a commitment required by the FHA and the VA never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required Levitt and many of the other builders like him to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a racially explicit federal policy, nothing de facto about it. And it wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats, by the way. This was written policy. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate applications of builders for federal bank guarantees for their loans. The manual prohibited the recommendation for a federal bank guarantee of a development that was going to be integrated. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that would be all white if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the federal policy manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that a developer in Detroit was required to construct to separate his proposed development from a nearby African-American neighborhood in order to be able to qualify for a federal bank guarantee. This notion of de facto segregation, I say, is utter nonsense. It has no basis in reality to it whatsoever. Well, the white working class families who were subsidized by the federal government to buy those homes in places like Levittown and suburbs all over the country, they were working class, returning war veterans. These were modest homes. They sold at the time for about $8,000. So today's money, that's about $100,000. 750 square foot homes. Those white working class families, returning war veterans and frequently returning war veterans, got wealthy over the next couple of generations as their homes appreciated in value. Most Americans who have any wealth get it from the equity they have in their homes. Those homes today no longer sell for $100,000, not in Levittown and not anywhere else in the country. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, some places over $1 million. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to buy those homes gained wealth, equity from that equity appreciation. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment or medical emergencies. They used it to finance their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is that today, the ongoing effect of this policy is the following. African Americans on average have incomes, family incomes, that are about 60% of white incomes. There's a disparity there. There's a different story behind that. I don't have time to go into that today. But you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in truth, while African American family incomes are about 60% of white family incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that's never been remedied, that all of us, every one of us, has never taken upon ourselves the obligation to remedy as we should under our Constitution. Well, that wealth gap is the determinant of so much of the ongoing racial inequality that we have in this country today. It reinforces segregation. African Americans, as I say, did not inherit wealth from their parents that they could use as down payments for their own homes. African Americans typically remain crowded in low-income neighborhoods where they were living still in the post-World War II period, from which whites were subsidized to leave. The segregation that results from this wealth gap not only determines the achievement gap in schools that I described before, health disparities between blacks and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease. It determines police abuse that we spent so much time demonstrating about in the last few months, and mass incarceration that results from it. We might have discriminatory policing to some extent, were it not for segregation, but not nearly to the extent that we have, because when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods, where they have no access to good jobs, no access to transportation to get to those jobs, no access to schools that have high achieving students, it's inevitable that the police will assume the stance of an occupying force controlling a low-income minority population, much as controlling colonial forces did in the Congo or in India or other colonial places where police or military forces served an occupying role. That's a consequence of segregation. And the segregation that was created in large part by this wealth gap, by this discriminatory federal policy, also predicts something I think even more serious than what I've already talked about, something very dangerous and frightening. And that's the political polarization that's so extreme in this country today that largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? There is no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences. So those are the consequences of this particular policy of segregation that the government followed. Let me describe one other that was also very powerful, and that's public housing, something I think all of us misunderstand, at least I did before I did this study and research for this book. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men, as I say, without jobs in the formal economy, deteriorated buildings, poorly maintained. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for working class families, people who had jobs. We had a high rate of unemployment and depression when public housing began in the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration. 25% of the workforce was unemployed, but 75% had jobs, and that's who public housing was for. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, built public housing for these unhoused but employed workers and their families. Everywhere the federal government built this housing, it segregated it, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. As I mentioned earlier, factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals, so you had lots of integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas. The federal government segregated many of them with public housing for the first time. So perhaps a good example for you in New Hampshire is something not so far away, Cambridge, Massachusetts. You've probably heard of that. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood in Cambridge, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half black and half white. The Public Works Administration built two separate projects there, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, created segregation, perpetuated and sustained it in a pattern that still exists today. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl. That's what you'd expect to be happening, and with some frequency, in an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland, demolished integrated housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed. This is how segregation was created on the West Coast for the first time. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to the West Coast to take jobs in war industries. They overwhelmed the communities where they moved to work in shipyards and aircraft facilities, factories. If the federal government wanted the ships and the aircraft and the tanks and the jeeps to be produced, they had to find housing for these workers. There was a very small African-American population on the West Coast prior to World War II. The great migration of African Americans to the West Coast hadn't taken place until the World War II jobs attracted them. The federal government had to find housing for these workers, and it did. It built housing on a segregated basis for workers working in the same war plants, creating segregation where it hadn't existed to any extent significantly prior to this time. San Francisco, for example, the federal government built 5 projects, public housing projects for war workers only. 4 were for whites. 1 was for African Americans, placed in the neighborhood of San Francisco that later became the Black neighborhood of San Francisco. Same policy was followed in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. There were many, many other policies followed by the federal government, as well as state and local governments to enforce segregation. One that was followed by state and local governments was the routing of the interstate highway system, which local officials had control of. The interstate highway system was built in the 1950s, and local officials frequently routed the highways that went through their communities, either to create a barrier between white and black neighborhoods. For example, if you know Chicago, the Dan Ryan Expressway was routed in that way to create a barrier between black and white neighborhoods, or in some cases to demolish black neighborhoods that city officials thought were too close to where whites were working and shopping, and they wanted to move black neighborhoods farther away from downtown, so they simply ran the highway system through it, explicitly on a racial basis. Let me say that the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about what to do about all of this. Think tanks generate paper after paper explaining what we could do to redress segregation. Policy writers, journalists, we know what to do. What's missing is not policy ideas about how to redress segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain residential segregation as it made it uncomfortable to maintain the segregation of lunch counters and buses and even schools in the 20th century. I can give you a few examples of the kinds of policies that are fairly obvious to implement in order to redress segregation. I described a few minutes ago how the white suburbs were created for working class families at an inexpensive price, white families only, $100,000 in those days. Those suburbs, as I said, the homes now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. What would be a narrowly targeted constitutional remedy for that violation? Well, the federal government should be buying up homes in those suburbs for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever the market requires, and reselling them to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And even John Roberts, if he was willing to recognize this well-established history, would have to agree that an affirmative action policy in housing like that was perfectly constitutional. We have policies at the low end of the income scale, disproportionately minority, disproportionately African American and Hispanic, that also reinforce segregation today, that are easy to change in principle, but for which there's no political support. The biggest program we have for low-income families is the low-income housing tax credit. It's a subsidy that the federal government gives to developers to build housing for low-income families. The Federal Treasury Department, which runs this subsidy program, has a regulation that places a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's crazy. It's backwards. Of course, we should build better housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should build better housing everywhere. But to place a priority in placing more low-income housing in already segregated neighborhoods, that reinforces segregation. We should have the opposite priority while we're building better housing everywhere. The federal government also has a program administered by localities that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's called the Section 8 voucher program, a subsidy to families to enable them to rent apartments at market rates that otherwise would be unaffordable to them. That program also reinforces segregation. For one thing, the landlords would frequently turn away Section 8 voucher holders, even though in some places it's prohibited by law, but the law is not well enforced. For another thing, the voucher amounts aren't sufficient to support rents in most places that are high opportunity as opposed to low-income segregated neighborhoods. So the result is that the Section 8 voucher program reinforces segregation. That program could easily be reformed to stop reinforcing segregation and to help families move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. One of the barriers to doing that and to changing the priorities of the low-income housing tax credit program is the zoning ordinances that many of these suburbs have adopted that prohibit the construction of townhouses or low-level apartments or garden apartments, anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes. In my judgment, those zoning ordinances reinforce an unconstitutionally segregated landscape, and therefore those zoning ordinances themselves should be challenged. And unless we do that, no matter how much we reform the Section 8 and the low-income housing tax credit programs, they'll be of limited value. Let me conclude by saying this. We need a new civil rights movement that is going to redress segregation. I am working with a group of national civil rights leaders, fair housing leaders, who are designing a new national committee to redress racial segregation in neighborhoods. Its purpose will be to create local civil rights groups to begin by addressing segregation in their own communities. We were about to launch this national committee when the pandemic social distancing requirements prevented us from doing so, but we're going to relaunch it in the fairly near future. And I see that my email address has been put in the chat room. If any of you would like to be on the list to be notified of the launch of this new National Committee to Redress Segregation, you should let me know and I'll make sure you get on that list. With that, I'd like to close and welcome a discussion and questions and answers. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for these illuminating remarks. If we had an audience, and we do have an audience, imagine their applause at this very moment. And thank you very much for your insights and remarks. And now to hear reactions to some of these things that you have pointed out, and to discuss perhaps some perspectives from New Hampshire, we'll now begin our panel discussion. Introducing the panelists and moderating the discussion is Sarah Matson-Dustin. Sarah Matson-Dustin is a legal aid lawyer and the executive director of New Hampshire Legal Assistance, a statewide nonprofit law firm providing civil legal aid to low-income and older people in New Hampshire. Sarah also previously worked at the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, where she oversaw the foundation's research, advocacy, and leadership development initiatives. Sarah sits on the New Hampshire Supreme Court's Access to Justice Commission, was a member of the New Hampshire Bar Association's inaugural Leadership Academy class, and received the 2010 New Hampshire Bar Foundation Robert E. Kirby Award. She earned her undergraduate and law degrees at Harvard. Sarah, thank you for joining us and for being willing to lead this panel discussion.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. What a fantastic showing. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to moderate our panel discussion this afternoon. In addition to Mr. Rothstein, we have three terrific New Hampshire experts joining us this afternoon to share their reflections and observations. And I'm going to kick it right off by introducing them. So Max will advance the slide. I think we're going to start. We've had this introduction, so we're going to go next to Representative Charlotte DiLorenzo. Representative DiLorenzo has been a member of the New Hampshire House of Representatives since 2016. She represents Rockingham 17. She's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Boston with a bachelor's degree in law and began her career as a paralegal before transitioning to a career in the housing industry. She has extensive experience working in property management and housing compliance, including for 7 years serving as commissioner of the Newmarket Housing Authority. As a New Hampshire legislator, she has been a champion of equity and affordability in housing, earning the 2018 Home Matters NH Award from Housing Action New Hampshire. Representative DiLorenzo, thank you so much for joining us today. You want to say hello? We'll go ahead on then to our next presenter, Dr. Marie Elizabeth Ramos. Dr. Ramos is a family physician activist, a writer, and a blogger with nearly a decade's experience practicing full-scope family medicine with obstetrics in Nashua. She's currently the medical director of Gatehouse Treatment Center, where she oversees an integrated primary care model for adults with substance use disorder. Dr. Ramos was a 2020 Union Leader 40 Under 40 recipient, and she focuses her passion in promoting health equity as a member of the board of directors for the New Hampshire Academy of Family Physicians, as well as the New Hampshire State Health Assessment Advisory Committee. Dr. Ramos, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure is mine. Looking forward to the conversation.
And our third New Hampshire expert is Mr. Ryan Terrell. Mr. Terrell evacuated from New Orleans, Louisiana in 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and came here to New Hampshire after receiving an academic scholarship to Southern New Hampshire University's College Unbound program. As an undergraduate student, he helped raise over $50,000 for one of our beloved New Hampshire housing nonprofits, Families in Transition. Also interned for local businesses, mentored with private and public sector leaders, and represented Southern New Hampshire University abroad. In October of last year, he founded Tribe, a textured hair care brand made to increase diversity and inclusion in the professional salon industry. He currently is a project manager with Evolve Salon Systems, a national hair care distributor, and is running for New Hampshire State Rep, serving Hillsborough 31, which is Nashua. Mr. Terrell, thank you for joining the panel this afternoon.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me.
So we're going to start our conversation this afternoon by asking each of our New Hampshire panelists to offer a brief reaction to Mr. Rothstein's presentation, maybe about 2 minutes each. They're welcome to ask any questions that came up based on or the book, and then we're going to give Mr. Rothstein also a chance to weigh in response to their observations. So we're going to start with Dr. Ramos. Do you want to share your observations?
Sure. Thank you so much, Richard, for coming and sharing some, I think, really interesting points about our own history. As a family doctor and mother of 3 in the school system and having grown up here in New Hampshire, a lot of the themes that you brought up historically really resonated in my experience, both personally, but then also with the patients that I serve. One of the things I'd love for you to touch on is housing as a social determinant of health. And so being a family doctor, seeing trends within communities in health outcomes, like you mentioned, with asthma, for instance, do you see, and can you elaborate a little bit more on these trends of the housing and the segregation of housing with health? And then the secondary thing on a different side is maybe discussing a little further the narratives that were used in order to help propagate particular thoughts of particularly African Americans within the housing structure. The fear tactics and the thought that having more diverse neighborhoods, for instance, would lower property values and increase the dissonance and resistance for bringing in more equitable housing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramos. Mr. Terrell, you're next on my list. Would you like to share your reactions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, thank you to Richard. The book speaks for itself. It's extremely thorough, extremely researched. So thank you for sharing that with us and the world. For me, I'm interested in hearing where do we move forward? And I know that you've listed several things that we can all consider, and you said at the end of your statements, well, we can all consider moving forward. So as a potential legislator in the state, I'm interested to see what those impacts we can make in New Hampshire. And also particularly because as I read your book and as I know the history of segregation and racial practices and discrimination throughout our country, it was interesting for me because I have not experienced the effects that are discussed in the books or discussed in your research. I, because of Hurricane Katrina, was very transient throughout a high school. Even living in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina, my communities have always been mixed racially and within socioeconomic status. After I moved to New England, I also experienced the same thing in New Hampshire. I currently live in Nashua, which is one of the most diverse districts within New Hampshire. And I live in an apartment that has almost 600 residents, all mixed race and all different backgrounds that come. So I'm really interested in feeling and understanding what is the current kind of effects of that segregation that you've gone in detail, and how as we as legislators and potential legislators and citizens can be informed on those modern effects.
Thank you for those insights. Appreciate it. Representative DiLorenzo, would you share your reactions with us as well?
Representative DiLorenzo, we can't hear you. You might want to check your audio. We can come back to you.
Give her 1 second. Well, we seem to be having trouble with audio for Representative DiLorenzo. Sorry about that. So let's go to our next question for the, or actually, Mr. Rothstein, I skipped over your responses. There were some great questions, some really interesting reactions. Please, we'd love to hear from you next.
Well, I'll try to be very brief. Let me make one note, though. I did look at the chat for a minute, and some people are asking to be put on the list to be notified about this committee to redress segregation. I can't do it through the chat. You're going to have to send me an email, and it's going to have to indicate the community that you live in, as well as your name and email address. So if you do that, I'd appreciate it. Well, first on health, I mentioned a couple of things already that are direct consequences of the segregation that we have, differences in life expectancy, cardiovascular disease, overcrowding itself. We know that the pandemic is affecting African American and Hispanic communities in particular at much greater rates than other communities. It's not because the pandemic, the virus is racially targeting people. It's because the segregation that we've created requires lower income, particularly disproportionately Black and Hispanic folks, to live in more overcrowded conditions where social distancing is less possible. So it's inevitable that the coronavirus is going to have a disparate impact on African Americans and Hispanics. And let me make a more general point about that. Once you have segregation, as we've established it, many race-neutral policies, whether it's a virus, which is not a policy, a race-neutral biological phenomenon, or a race-neutral policy, will reinforce the segregation without being explicitly racial. And there are many policies like that that reinforce segregation, even though they're no longer racially explicit. For example, African Americans living in segregated neighborhoods pay higher property taxes than they should, simply because in most places, white neighborhoods appreciate in value faster than Black neighborhoods do. When that happens, the difference between assessed values and market rate values gets greater in white neighborhoods than in Black neighborhoods. So Black families are paying a disproportionately high rate of property tax and therefore bearing in a disproportionate burden for financing schools and fire departments and libraries and so forth. The property tax system itself isn't racially targeting, but it has that disparate effect simply because we have segregated neighborhoods. Where do we move forward? My view is we move forward primarily as citizens. I don't think that there's very much legislation that we can enact. There's some, but there's not very much legislation that we can enact that would have public support that would make the kind of significant difference in redressing segregation that's necessary. There'll be support for building more affordable housing in low-income neighborhoods, but the no, not in my backyard syndrome will prevent that housing from being built in higher opportunity neighborhoods. So my focus, and I'm speaking to you, all of you as citizens, not as policymakers, I think our burden at this point is to be participants in the new civil rights movement. The comment that you made, Ryan, about your experience living in integrated communities and neighborhoods was fascinating. Of course, the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 has had some effect, and there are non-segregated neighborhoods and buildings in many parts of the country. There are communities like the one you live in that are diverse. There are many of those, but there are a tiny minority of the communities throughout the country. All white or mostly white suburbs still dominate the landscape of white residents in this country. So for example, let me give you this one example from the one I used in the talk I gave, Levittown. I talked about Levittown before. As a result of the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you can now move to Levittown. We're no longer preventing you from moving to Levittown, if you can afford it. And the homes now cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. There are some African Americans who can afford that, obviously. And as a result, Levittown is now about 2% African American. In a broader community, it's about 15% African American. So the difference between that 2% and the 15% is the difference that the Fair Housing Act is incapable of redressing without affirmative action policy that is specifically aimed at enabling African Americans to live in higher opportunity communities. But it's certainly the case that we've made some progress in the area that you talked about. The progress is limited, as indicated by the statistic I gave you before, that our schools are more segregated now than they have been at any time in the last 45 years or so. And that's because of neighborhood segregation.
Thank you so much. Representative DiLorenzo, is your audio back? I wanted to give you a chance to offer your initial reflection if your audio is working again. Okay, well, sorry about that, folks. So I am surprised to see in the chat we have people tuning in from all over the world. And so we are going to zoom in a little bit on New Hampshire because we do have a New Hampshire focused panel today. And so I'm going to next ask our panelists to share any observations they have about housing in New Hampshire right now, circa 2020, any ways in which you see or don't see the enduring effects of the government policies that were described in the presentation today and are described in the book. So, Mr. Trell, could we start with you?
Yeah, of course. So if we focus in New Hampshire, some of the work that I do outside of Evolve is with Anagnos Companies, which is a real estate development firm out of Manchester. And we have several workforce development housing projects that we've put into place within the past 5 years. And I would have to agree with Richard on the zoning, because the biggest pushback that we get when we try to develop workforce housing is zoning and planning boards giving us the pushback on maybe this is not the right community for that type of development. And I certainly see that happening in New Hampshire. What I will say is we've never had an experience where it's been outright racial. Of course, as Richard's research and as he stated, very rarely will something be overtly racially motivated. But what I do see is that typically communities, when you start to talk about workforce housing, they confuse or often just mix together what workforce housing is with low-income housing. And they associate the individuals that are going to benefit from low-income housing with the individuals that would benefit from workforce housing, when in fact, those are two different things. When we talk about workforce housing, we're talking about individuals who are policemen, firefighters, teachers, people that work within the community that are earning working level wages. When we talk about public housing, a lot of the time, or low income housing, we're talking about individuals that are earning under the medium income level and thus need some type of support in housing. So often what I'm finding in New Hampshire is that there is a feeling that the individuals that would come with workforce housing are going to bring ills on the community in some way, whether that be socioeconomic stress because they're not earning as much as the proposed community, whether it's stress on the local school systems, where now what we're also seeing is some communities are hesitant to bring in large families because of the tax burden that it takes when you increase the amount of students that go into that school system. So for me, as I look at New Hampshire is interesting because it has a low minority population. New Hampshire has roughly about 2% African Americans, and I think about 4% Hispanic and Latinos. But these types of effects on those communities are found not necessarily for direct racial reasons as shown in the book, but more because of the demographic factors that found those who would benefit from developing workforce and affordable housing. So that's been interesting for me. And then also as an individual living in New Hampshire, as I said, when I first moved here from college and when I graduated, I found that it was very difficult to try to find affordable rental housing, not necessarily because I was being steered in a different direction because of my race, but more because of credit. Frankly, credit is a large determining factor in who qualifies for certain housing, who qualifies for home loans, who qualifies for certain rents. So I find if there is any governmental program or anything that we can start to look at and how the government can help these situations, I agree with Richard that it is a lot of civic duty that we should do as citizens, but maybe there's something we should investigate in how individuals improve their credit to thus be able to qualify for those loans, to be able to move into housing programs and in neighborhoods and suburbs that he's mentioned. And so that for me is what I look at when I think about the lens in New Hampshire. And I know that we want to keep this brief, but another thing for everybody to kind of mull over that's watching is the effect that potentially a New Hampshire rail would have on our affordable housing shortage within New Hampshire. As we as a state try to figure out, do we want New Hampshire rail, do we not? I think it's important for us to think about if we open up access to New Hampshire to rail, how does that affect our lower income and workforce communities with access to those affordable rental housing, but also affordable home ownership?
Thank you so much. Really interesting. And there was I can't monitor all of the chat because they're coming fast and furious, but there was an interesting comment indicating that some of the same stigma here in New Hampshire is applied to manufactured housing and mobile home communities as well as traditional multifamily workforce housing. So I thought that was an interesting response. Representative DiLorenzo, I'm told your audio is back.
Is it?
Oh, excellent. Great.
Oh,
So
great. Super.
would be happy for you to offer your initial reaction or also just to jump to your thoughts about the state of housing and the housing market in New Hampshire today.
Okay. Well, everyone, I'm so sorry for the lack of sound, but I'm really excited to talk about this topic. You know, before I read The Color of Law, I thought that I had known a lot about government housing policy. However, I did not know about the Federal Housing Administration's major role in creating segregated housing throughout the country. I thought that private real estate developers were responsible for redlining and blockbusting. I knew about urban renewal and slum clearance policies developed by local authorities and funded by state and federal taxpayer dollars. Now, those policies wiped out entire neighborhoods and displaced renters and homeowners. This took place in Boston, Mass, in the South End, West End neighborhood, and Lower Roxbury. Today, those areas are gentrified, and the average person cannot afford to buy or rent in those neighborhoods. You know, when President Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and Congress created the Federal Housing Administration in 1932, African Americans could not get loans from the FHA. We were excluded from buying homes at housing developments like Levittown, as Dr. Rothstein had said, in New York, and the Veterans Administration guaranteed mortgages for returning servicemen excluded African Americans. So there's a lot to be fixed here. And I don't know what the solutions are or how to fix it, but hopefully we can come up with some answers as a result of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ramos, I know you have some thoughts about this topic as well.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. You know, I think that this is really interesting in New Hampshire. So New Hampshire is, for many intents and purposes, a suburb. We have many people that go across the border to work in Boston, but we're also highly concentrated as far as education is concerned. And so we have this dichotomy I see within the state on a policy level and from a social level, where we're trying to keep and maintain our young professional families. But then there's also pushback in creating affordable housing for those young families that are creating a foundation for themselves. So there's that dichotomy that I recognize. And I also, even though we don't necessarily think or say overtly and explicitly that race plays a role, I would beg to say that historically, because of the narratives and the framework in segregating our housing system, there's an image that comes when we think about, like Ryan said, when we think about workforce housing, there's an image that comes into many people's minds. And there's concepts and discussion, even where I live, you know, hearing local townspeople say, you know, well, we don't want that community, and those kind of people don't necessarily fit with our community. Well, who are they, right? Who are those people? And oftentimes the workers that I take care of and the people that I take care of that are in concentrated urban areas within New Hampshire also feel that level of dissonance when they're trying to move between economic echelons, so to speak. So there is that tension there. We also know that although there shouldn't be any discrimination as far as loans, we still know that people of color have less likelihood of getting low interest loans and are less likely to sell at a profitable rate as well, even when we are in we've made it, so to speak. So I think that we have an interesting combination of circumstances, and all of this does lend, as you said, Dr. Rothstein, it lends to our propagation of being well as a community. And so I would be very interested to see how in New Hampshire, one, we could mitigate and help to mitigate risk. And there was a comment in the comment section that I'd like to speak to. Someone said that as far as providing loans and mortgages to high risk populations, well, private banks can't necessarily take on that risk. And there is a piece of truth, as Mr. Rothstein's book mentioned, but also there's historically speaking that people of color have been noted to be a higher risk category. I have colleagues that were very confused as to why they still needed to mention their race when they were applying for mortgage loans or trying to get a small business loan, for instance. So I think that there are simple things that might be able to mitigate those, but to say that there is absolutely no racializing of the policies and practices and procedures in our housing system, even in a vastly homogenous state like New Hampshire, I think that misses the point. And I think also that it takes away from the experience of many of our young professionals and young families, as well as families of color.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick it back over to Mr. Rothstein. You just heard some of our New Hampshire experts tell you what they're seeing here in our state. Do you have any reactions to that?
Yeah, there are a couple of comments I'd like to make. Ryan brought up two very important points that I want to comment on. Historically, in many parts of the country, not everywhere, but in many parts of the country, and I think that's true certainly in parts of New Hampshire today, the private sector is incapable of providing housing not only for the poor, but for working families, for the teachers and nurses and construction workers that he was talking about. But there are no subsidies available in most places. There are some local subsidies. The federal government has only subsidies for the lowest income families. So we have this absurd situation where we have inclusionary zoning policies that create market rate housing with set aside units for the lowest income families and nothing for the families in between. So teachers and nurses and construction workers, hotel and restaurant workers, people with jobs whose earnings are too high to qualify for the low income subsidies are priced out of the market with nowhere to turn except to move farther away from affluent, gentrifying, high opportunity communities. That's one thing that needs to be fixed, and the federal government is unlikely to fix it if there are going to be subsidies provided to make sure that we have well integrated by income housing units. It's going to have to come from state government. There are teachers that and people we were just talking about can't live in the communities where they work. That's a tragedy, and it's an abuse of the housing market that needs to be fixed. The other thing that he mentioned I want to comment on is credit. I talked before about how once you have a segregated system, you don't need race explicit policies to perpetuate and reinforce that segregation. The credit system is one of those that has a disparate impact on African Americans in particular, and Hispanics and lower income families, reinforcing this segregation. If you apply for a mortgage, you have to have a credit score that indicates how good your credit is. And if you've owned a home in the past and you've made your monthly payments on time, you get a high credit score. If you've been a renter and make your rental payments on time, that's not counted. That's a discriminatory policy. It's not explicitly racial. It doesn't say that it's designed to keep African Americans and Hispanic families from having good credit scores. But once we have this segregated system, that can reinforce it. That's something that needs to be changed. Banks should be prohibited from using these discriminatory credit scoring systems, these disparately discriminatory credit scoring systems and evaluating applicants for mortgages.
Great, thank you. So we're seeing a lot of questions in the chat about solutions. What can local governments do? What can individuals do? And there are some solutions proposed in the book. There were some mentioned in the talk. And so let's dig into that now. Representative DiLorenzo, will you start us off and just share your thoughts on what some preferred solutions either here in New Hampshire or in the entire country would be?
Oh, sure. Well, I know that in the book, Richard mentioned a Massachusetts development law called Chapter 40B. And under that program, developers that build apartment buildings or developments or townhouse communities are required to set aside 25% of those units dedicated to low-income housing. There's also there was a program in Boston called the Linkage Program, so that developers building, say, commercial buildings were required to pay into a linkage fund that would fund low and moderate income housing throughout the city of Boston. I think some other solutions, one that HUD had, and a program that HUD had, and I'm not sure what happened with that, was that people with Section 8 housing vouchers were allowed to use those voucher payments to buy homes and pay a mortgage. I think that program has gone away, but I think it sounds like a really wonderful program.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that housing cooperatives would be wonderful, where residents can build equity in their investment and, maybe eventually use that equity to buy a single family home if that's what their desire is. So there are solutions out there. We just need to put on our thinking caps and make them work.
Thank you. And thank you for that optimistic note at the end of those remarks. Dr. Ramos, what do you think we should do?
Yes, thank you. So, I think, and coming from the medical field and just through observation, I am a huge proponent of education. I think sometimes we can be misinformed to think that improved housing equity and reducing discrimination in housing somehow just benefits those who are in an oppressed community or a community that is lacking, but it actually benefits everyone. So I think that if we can help with further education of our communities about the positive aspects of diversifying communities, how that can bring more enrichment and actually improve property value and wealth potential in the long run, I think that would be helpful in bringing the majority along. As Dr. Rothstein said, in order for movements to happen, and something that was so pivotal with the civil rights movement was that it wasn't just Black and brown people that were marching in the streets, that there was an allyship that occurred, and there was an investment in a critical mass of all Americans to invest within, to see the benefits of integration and desegregation. And I think the same level of investment needs to happen in order for us to make critical change. The last thing I did recognize too is that having worked in a rural community, I was a family doctor in a town of 3,000 with one headlight and doing Dr. Quinn medicine in the mountains of California at one point of my career. These housing issues are also relevant in white rural America as well. We may not necessarily see, you may not necessarily hear about that, but as far as New Hampshire is concerned, our North Country is suffering as much as any other place in the country as well. And understanding that when we can create more equitable experiences from a housing perspective for minorities and for historically excluded populations and communities, then that actually benefits everyone. So I think those 3 points would be helpful, and basing this particularly in education.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. And finally, Mr. Terrell, do you have any solutions?
I do. A few things come to mind. And first, I just want to thank everybody for participating in this. And obviously, thank you, Richard, for sharing all of your knowledge and insight. This has been amazing. The first thing that comes to mind with me is we need to diversify and allow for some flexibility in the programs that serve to develop workforce housing or affordable housing. You know, a lot of these programs are addressing lower income, but we need to develop some type of mechanisms that inspire the development of workforce and affordable housing for individuals that are not just lower income. You know, the middle class is someone that the burden is now being placed upon the middle class. So finding ways to give middle class rental and housing is absolutely important. The other thing we can look at is trying to find enterprise level funding for developers. What happens now is you get funding for an individual project as a developer, but if you have a grand vision for how you would like to develop more affordable housing across larger communities, you now need to get funding for each individual project. If we can be approved for enterprise level funding, now trailblazers within the development community can go out and do larger development scaled affordable housing programs that can help to just redirect some of these inequalities that have happened because of the policies that we've all discussed right now. Another thing that's always important with moving forward a major initiative like this is private-public partnerships. So trying to find ways that we engage the private sector developers with also the public sector to make these types of initiatives move forward. But then also something that we just discussed is looking at this from not just a housing standpoint, but an overall sustainability and measure the comprehensive impact. One of the biggest things about developing workforce housing or affordable housing or low income from a developer side is you're trying to figure out how do we bring up the economic development of the entire community. If we look at how housing plays into, like Richard said, transportation and health and the ecosystem by which these communities are living in, that's going to be important for bringing this type of a matter and improving the situation in a more systemic fashion. And then to kind of close personally for me, and this comes from my personal experience, I, as a legislator, am trying to find ways that we create an alternative form of renter's credit check to approve people to be able to move into housing that maybe their credit is low, but they display all the responsible behaviors to afford to be able to live in rental. I know that we're decreasing on time, but very quickly, I was disqualified from several different apartments after graduating college, not because I wasn't earning enough income. I was earning almost 3 times the required income for the rent. It was solely because of my poor credit and lack of credit that I was disqualified from moving into certain places. So as Richard discussed, right now, if you're paying your phone bill, your rent on time, which is largely where our lower income or even people of color are living, you're not getting positive credit for making those payments on time. So an individual who is otherwise worthy to have a loan, worthy to have somewhere that they should stay, is being overlooked simply because of the way that we look at credit right now. And I think that we as a country should investigate how do we create alternative means by which to give these individuals access that are not the traditional credit system that we have. And then last but not least, it's voter education. Right? Because if we are dealing with zoning boards and town planning boards, these are elected positions. And right now, our communities need to participate and watch panels like this. We need to go out and mobilize voters to teach them about all the things affecting their housing so that they can elect the proper elected officials to have these public-private relationships to move forward with these types of initiatives. Because if zoning and ordinances are blocked, that is a town level function that is directly driven by voters, and that's where the voter mobilization and voter knowledge should begin. And that, for me, is where we can start to kind of counteract some of these effects that Richard has very, very extensively researched.
Thank you so much, Mr. Terrell, and I appreciate that you reminded all of us of the importance of keeping tabs on not only what our state legislators and our Congress people are doing, but also what our local boards are doing as well. So thank you for that point. So I want to offer just a slight twist on this question to Mr. Rothstein to close us out tonight. there were a lot of points reading the book when I felt sad, I felt angry, but I think the moment when I felt the most despair was when you wrote that it's incredibly difficult to make progress on this issue during times of economic uncertainty. We are, of course, living through a time of profound economic uncertainty. So is there anything that is giving you hope right now, or anything that you think we can look ahead to make progress on this incredibly consequential issue?
Well, I'm very hopeful, not confident, but hopeful. We are having now in this country today a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever had before in American history. You know, it's not just my book that's had an enormous impact. You know, when my book was published 3.5 years ago, the publisher ordered 5,000 copies, and he thought he was going to be stuck with most of them. It's had enormous influence. But it's not just my book. It's Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It's Brian Stevens's book, Just Mercy. If you look at the bestseller lists, they're almost all about race. We are having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before. We have white elected Southern politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate slavery. That was unheard of 5 years ago. Inconceivable. In response to the murder of George Floyd, 25 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and an unprecedented number of whites participated in those demonstrations. So I'm very, very hopeful. Out of that awareness, out of these discussions, out of that participation in demonstrations, a new civil rights movement can emerge. It won't happen automatically. It's going to take intentionality. Simply shouting slogans and demonstrating is not going to create any change. We need local civil rights groups that are active and disciplined and strategic in how they approach many of the issues that you all have put forward. But I am hopeful. The book made me hopeful. So long as the book research made me hopeful, so long as we think that this all happened by accident, it's very easy to think it can only unhappen by accident, and who knows when that will happen. Once we understand that the segregation of this country, the inequality of this country, was the product of explicit government policy, it's easy to understand that explicit government policy can undo it, can reverse it. And we need to be mobilized and organized to do it. And I'm looking forward to the time when we emerge from this pandemic and we can have a new civil rights movement that redresses the segregation that our government, on our behalf, has created.
Thank you so much. So there have been so many fantastic questions in the chat. I'm so sorry that we're out of time and we can't get to more of them. I will say, pick up the book. A lot of the questions are answered in the book. Not all of them, but lots of them. It's a wonderful read. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Max, to close us out.
Well, that concludes our program for today. I'd like to thank Richard for his tremendous insights, Sarah for her excellent moderating skills, and our panelists, Charlotte, Ryan, and Marie, for a stimulating discussion. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for participating. At one point, we had close to 600 people, which is fantastic. Please feel free to send us any reactions and feedback at ethics@anselm.edu. And keep an eye out for upcoming programs and events on our website, anselm.edu/ethics. Thank you all once again, and have a good evening.